When it comes to trading and investing, some of the most popular products that we use are market indexes. And when we talk about a market index, today I want to talk about three of the most popular market index products. I'm going to talk about the S&P 500, the Nasdaq 100, and the Dow 30. And specifically, I want to talk about which individual companies within those indexes actually has the most influence. We're going to talk about a little bit of the weighting of these index products, why you should know which companies are the most weighted in those indexes, and how it's going to affect you as a trader. So, the top holdings in the major indices. These are the most influential stocks of the S&P, the Nasdaq, and the Dow. So, what is a stock market index? Well, a stock market index tracks the performance of a group of stocks in a particular market. Essentially, what these big products we're talking about today, they're trying to be a way to gauge the overall performance of the stock market. So, we're talking about the broader stock market, the global stock market, or the U.S. stock market, although the U.S. stock market is really kind of the global stock market because most companies around the world, if they're of any importance, typically will trade on the U.S. exchanges, the New York Stock Exchange and the Nasdaq. And there are thousands and thousands and thousands of companies that trade on the New York Stock Exchange and the Nasdaq exchange. So what these index products do is they try to have a curated list of a few stocks that give you a good kind of way to gauge the overall stock market performance. So with the S&P 500, they obviously collect a group of 500 important stocks, and that's the S&P 500 index, and that's a good way for you to gauge the performance of the overall stock market is just taking a look at what the S&P 500 is doing. The Nasdaq 100 is basically, the Nasdaq exchange has thousands and thousands of publicly traded companies on it, so they curate their list to this Nasdaq 100. It's the top 100 stocks that trade on the Nasdaq exchange. The Dow 30, again, it's a 30 stock index. They're just trying to collect 30 very important stocks across various sectors. It's not all tech, where Nasdaq is very tech heavy, and the S&P 500 is quite tech heavy as well. The Dow tries to include some other things in various sectors, financials and consumer staples and things like that. But what they collect 30 stocks, and again, it's designed to be an index that you can use to gauge how the overall stock market is performing. One of these indexes in particular, the S&P 500, is so popular, generally speaking, when an investor or a trader talks about the, quote, market, they're usually referring to the S&P 500. Again, that's kind of used as the benchmark. That tells you what the broader stock market is doing. Now, these indices, they weight certain stocks more than others, and that's kind of naturally how it has to go. Some companies actually are more important than others. So we don't track, for example, the S&P 500 by, every stock that ticks up $1 gets counted as $1. Every stock that ticks down $1 is counted as $1, because again, you have to weight certain companies more than others. For example, the really big companies, let's say Apple, right? Are we going to treat Apple as the same way as something like Walgreens, right? Both are in the S&P 500, but one of those companies is kind of a bad company that's near bankruptcy and hasn't really been very influential on the stock market at all. Would you want to weight Walgreens the same as you weight Apple in your index? No, of course not. Would you want to weight something like O'Reilly Auto Parts the same way you weight something like Walmart? Again, obviously not. So the way these products are typically weighted, especially with the S&P and the Nasdaq, they're weighted based on market cap. The bigger the company, the bigger the weighting. So the largest companies in the world include Apple, Microsoft, Nvidia, Amazon, Meta. Those are your big companies. They get the most weighting. Whatever those companies do, they really affect the S&P 500 and the Nasdaq 100 in a big way. And smaller companies, for example, if eBay went out of business tomorrow, right? I don't think it's going to affect the S&P and the Nasdaq, right? It could completely collapse and go bankrupt. Nobody would care, right? It's very different, though, if a very large company like, Tesla or AMD, went bankrupt, or had some kind of major event. That would affect the S&P 500 and the Nasdaq in a huge way. While the S&P and the Nasdaq are weighted based on market cap, the Dow does something a little different. They actually don't weight based on market cap. They weight based on price. So the higher the share price of the stock, the more weighting it gets in the Dow. So that makes the Dow a little different among these three index products. So let's talk about the top holdings in each of these indices. So let's start with the S&P 500. So these are the top 20 holdings in the S&P 500. These have the most weighting, and these slides could be a little off as far as which stocks have the most weighting because it's constantly changing. They're constantly re-weighting these indexes, but as best I can tell, this right now is the top 20 holdings of the S&P 500, and the first, I would say 7 to 10, you probably could have guessed all the names. If you've been trading just for a few months even, you probably know that the most influential companies are Apple, Microsoft, Nvidia, Amazon, Meta, Google, Tesla, Broadcom, Google a second time here in the S&P 500, Berkshire Hathaway is here, JP Morgan, obviously the largest bank, rounding out the top 11 here. And really, after you get past the first 10, which are all tech stocks, JP Morgan, largest bank, financial stock, Eli Lilly, pharmaceutical, United Healthcare, obviously healthcare, ExxonMobil is in the energy sector, Costco is a retailer, Walmart is a retailer, Home Depot also retailer. Now let's take a look at the top 20 holdings of the Nasdaq 100, and you will notice something, especially about the first 10 or so. If I go back, here is the top 20 holdings of the S&P. Take a look at this column here, these stocks here. Now take a look at the top 20 holdings of the Nasdaq. And yeah, it's pretty much the same names. The order may be slightly different, but it's essentially the same names. Why is that? Because both the S&P 500 and the Nasdaq 100 are weighted based on market cap. So they have the same, a lot of the same companies in both indexes. And when they weight based on market cap, they end up with the same kind of weighting on certain stocks. So the most influential stocks of the Nasdaq: Apple, Microsoft, Nvidia, Amazon, Google, Meta, Tesla, Broadcom, Costco, and Netflix. You probably didn't see Costco being in the top 10 of the Nasdaq 100. That kind of surprised me when I put together this list. Some other things I didn't realize would have been in here. And again, some of the weighting may have changed recently. I don't know how old some of the data that I went and, because I was asking, Google or ChatGPT, give me the top 20 holdings of the NASDAQ. And you've got things in here like T-Mobile, I would not have expected. AstraZeneca, I would not have expected. Pepsi is here. But you've also got a lot of names that do make sense. Adobe, AMD, and Qualcomm. I certainly would have guessed that those would have made the top 20. Now let's take a look at the Dow 30. And because the Dow 30 is only 30 stocks, let's just take a look at the entire 30 stock list. And this is a list of them alphabetically, because remember, they're not weighted based on market cap. So this is an alphabetical list of the 30 stocks that make up the Dow. And you get some names in here that you would not have had as far as like top holdings of the S&P 500 or the Nasdaq 100. You do have like the major players here. Like you do have Apple, Amazon, Microsoft, and Nvidia, right? You've got those four big mega cap tech stocks. They are here. But again, the Dow 30 does not want to be just a bunch of tech stocks. So they also have things in here like UNH, United Healthcare, right? Walmart's here. Procter & Gamble, Johnson & Johnson, Coca-Cola, McDonald's, 3M, Merck. You've got some oil companies here. You got, Chevron, CVX is in here. You've got Boeing and Caterpillar, American Express. The Dow has a lot of these blue chip, long-time dividend-paying stocks. The old guard, right? Things like Johnson & Johnson and Procter & Gamble, right? These are not sexy stocks like active traders, especially active options traders. We're probably not trading those kinds of companies. So it's kind of like, from decades past, this is the boomer index, right? The Dow 30 is for the boomers. And because the Dow is price weighted, right? It's weighted based on the share price of the stocks. The highest share price stocks are going to get the most weighting. So the top 5 Dow stocks by weight percentage are Goldman Sachs, United Healthcare, Microsoft, Home Depot, and Caterpillar. And if you follow the Dow 30, you do need to know this, because typically when the Dow makes a big move, I always assume that especially Goldman Sachs or UNH, United Healthcare, I typically want to see what those are doing because they have some weighting. Also Home Depot and Caterpillar, you need to know about that. And of course Microsoft was kind of expected. Obviously, if you're following the stock market at all, you probably know what Microsoft is doing each and every day, because it's also one of the biggest components to the S&P and the Nasdaq. Now, the way these index products are weighted does sometimes draw criticisms. You will hear people, especially in financial media, sometimes complain about the weighting. And just know this, while the S&P and the Nasdaq, they do re-weight themselves every now and then, sometimes they can get a bit out of whack where a company has far more, or in some cases far less weight than it actually deserves, at least until the next re-weighting. An example of this would be this insane run-up that Nvidia had in 2023 and 2024, is just exploding in price all the time. Well, Nvidia was kind of underweighted in the index products because it was constantly, going up to where, until they do the next reweighting, it was kind of underweight. And of course, some people complain about the overweighting of all the mega cap tech stocks, because the S&P 500, the Nasdaq 100, it's really just a small group of these trillion-dollar companies: Apple, Microsoft, Nvidia, Amazon, Google, Meta. Those things dominate the indices, right? They are essentially the S&P 500 and the Nasdaq 100. If you got rid of all the other stocks but those six I just named, that is essentially what really is the Nasdaq 100 and the S&P 500. And it's very important that you actually know this, and that's the purpose of this video today, is why do you need to know the weighting of these index products? Well, the reason you need to know is, let's say I want to go trade SPY. Everybody trades the S&P 500 products like SPX, SPY, ES, MES. Let's say I want to go sell a put in SPY. I'm going to go to the 74-day cycle. I'm going to sell the 19 delta put. Right now, let's say I put on that trade. It's a bullish trade, short put in SPY. Now let's say, hey, I want to trade Microsoft today. Let me go trade Microsoft. I'm going to go to the 74-day cycle, and maybe I want to sell the 19 delta short put in Microsoft. And do you see the problem with this? If you've been paying attention to the slideshow, you already know Microsoft, one of the biggest components to the S&P 500. I already sold that 20 delta put in SPY. Do I need to go sell a 20 delta put in Microsoft as well? Aren't they kind of the same trade? And the answer to that question is yes, they're essentially the same trade. If I go and let's go take a look at Apple. I'll go to the 74-day cycle and I'll sell the 20 delta put. I've just made the same trade three different ways, because whatever Apple and Microsoft do, the SPY will do. Or whatever the SPY does, chances are Apple and Microsoft also made that move, because they're the ones that really have the most weighting in the S&P 500. So again, this is why you need to know the weighting of these index products, so you don't make the mistake of going and essentially duplicating the same trade 2, 3, 4, 5 different ways. And then you really get burned. For example, when the S&P 500 makes a sharp move down and you sold a bunch of puts on Apple, Nvidia, Microsoft, Meta, right? You're just going to get killed on all of them because they all kind of move generally in the same direction with each other. Now, some people want to play around with different weightings in the S&P and the Nasdaq. There are actual products that do equal weighting in the S&P and the Nasdaq. By equal weighting, it means we're not going to give extra weighting to Apple compared to Walgreens, for example. They're the same. We're going to give them the same percentage of that index. And if you want products like that, you could use products like RSP, which is an equal weighted S&P 500 ETF. You could use a product like QQQE for an equal weighted Nasdaq 100. Just know this, these products aren't really all that popular. They don't have a lot of volume, and thus liquidity can be an issue. These are products I can tell you personally, I've never traded traded, they would be very difficult to actually trade options on. So there you have it, a little bit about the top holdings in the S&P 500, the Nasdaq 100, and the Dow 30. Now, if you want to learn a little more about options trading, and especially my favorite option strategy, which is the wheel option strategy, check out my book, The Super Wheel Option Strategy, available on Amazon. You'll find a link to this book in the description below. Also, in this book, I do have a chapter. One of the chapters is called The Underlyings, and in that, I describe various futures products, popular ETFs, index products, various individual companies that are very popular for trading, especially trading options. So please check out that book. Also, if you want to help support this channel, please subscribe to the DT Options Discord server. I hold a live voice chat there each and every trading day. We get together, I share my trading platform. You get to see all the opening and closing trades I make each and every morning, and we've got a nice little trading community there. We'd love to have you. Peace, guys.